Welcome to the latest episode of Call to the Bar, International Law Over Drinks, or as this episode should be known, Call to the Borderline Jurisprudence Over Drinks. I'm your hostess with the mostest, Dr Tamsin Phillipa Paige, Associate Professor at Deakin Law School. Today we're discussing podcasts and their role in international law discourse. And for our listeners out there who aren't sociologists, discourse generally refers to the broader context in which any individual text sits. But that means the UN Charter would be considered a text, but the situation in which you are reading and applying it, the context of that would be the discourse. We're doing this with our star-studded array of people. So we have Dr. Kostia Gorobets, Assistant Professor at University of Groningen, Başak Etkin, a PhD scholar at University of Groningen, both of Borderline Jurisprudence fame, and Professor Douglas Guilfoyle. This is what happens when you try and say doctor and Douglas at the same time. You end up with doctor. Professor of International Law and Security at University of New South Wales, Canberra, Dr. Juliet McIntyre, who's a senior lecturer at University of South Australia, was supposed to join us but has had a family emergency, so our thoughts are with her. Before we begin, I remind everyone that in these informal conversations, we are, as always, speaking off the cuff and without the benefit of footnotes, and nothing we should say should be taken to have been thoroughly peer-reviewed. And before we get down to business, our traditional first question, everyone, what's your drink?
Shall I go first? I have a black Turkish tea from the Black Sea coast, brewed in a blasphemous, sacrilegious manner that my mom would probably disown me for because I don't have the big proper teapot, and I just brewed a tiny little cup, and hopefully it'll wake me up.
Yeah, it's still morning in the Netherlands, so it's, I think, 9:30 or something, and it's Monday. So I'm drinking also tea, Darjeeling tea, also because I'm slightly under the weather, so I'm trying to keep my throat warm. Yeah, it's very nice, in fact. Nothing special, very traditional, very classic.
And it's a later hour here, but still early in the week, so I'm having a Paradox Wines non-alcoholic Pinot Grigio.
I have embraced the cool change that has signaled the start of autumn and made myself a orange hot chocolate with hot chocolate powder from Grounded Pleasures, and it is absolutely delicious, and I look forward to the first hot chocolate of the year, and this is it, so it's a bit of a special one. Now, we have actually never met in person, but we met via Zoom when you generously asked me to come on Borderline Jurisprudence and talk about sociology and queerness and pastry and what it all has to do with international law. And then you caused my DMs to explode when you interviewed sainted Judge Charlesworth, blessed be her name. However, I would say that before this we know each other from Twitter, rest its digital soul. Başak and Kostia, would you like to tell us how you know the Call to the Bar crew?
Yeah, it has been Twitter all along, in fact, right? And of course, it pains me to see what it has become, especially given that just some 5 or so years ago, it was the platform on which I encountered all the incredible international legal scholars, including, of course, you, all of the crew, and all of the amazing Australian scholars who are now my friends and colleagues. But yeah, it is amazing that we have never seen each other in person. And in fact, we were just discussing before the recording that when we started our podcast, we didn't meet in person either. Me and Başak, yeah, we only met, I think, a year after we started or something. Is that right?
Yeah. I was just thinking that, like, not only did we meet the Call to the Bar crew on Twitter, but we also met each other on Twitter.
Yeah.
And it was the pandemic times, and I don't know, Twitter was our only social interaction when we were locked down. But yeah, we both did meet Dina in person then afterwards at a conference, but none of the other ones. And for example, with Juliet, we talk about Korean dramas and things. So I'd call us friends.
Yeah. I also met Dina. I think she's the only one from Call to the Bar crew whom I met a couple of times, twice in Europe, I think, and once in the United States. But yeah, I mean, Twitter was amazing back in the days because I think it's where the Borderline Jurisprudence started. I think the idea was somehow played around in December 2020, and we released our first episode in April 21. And I think we met in person for the first time, if memory serves me well, somewhere in October 21.
November. I think it's 4th of November.
Yeah.
Because I used to keep a very tidy diary, so sometimes I remember the dates vividly.
Well, that's most impressive. I remember no dates vividly from the pandemic period. It's just one big sort of soup in my mind. But I do recall that, Twitter was kind of a professional lifeline. It felt to me like a kind of multinational faculty tea room, right? Like it was where I went to hang out to talk about work, essentially, or also attempt to stay sane by whatever means necessary, which I think in my case included poetry reading on Twitter for reasons I now can't recall, but it seemed a good idea at the time.
Well, it's when I started, doing the academic selfie to motivate myself to get out of bed and put on my makeup and do some work. So I know you were doing it before that, Douglas, but it became more than just you during COVID times. Yeah, it's a whole thing. And what I'm hearing about you not having met the rest of the Call to the Bar crew in person is that we need to bring you over for an ANZL conference. So
that's an excellent idea.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. What can I say?
Excellent. We'll have to make it happen. Now, as first-time guests on the pod, our traditional question before we get to the main event is, how did you get into international law? What was your career path that brought you to your current place in space and time?
So this all started when I was in middle school because we had a very intense reading of Anne Frank's diary, and I put it to my mind that I needed to go into human rights. And then I was a Model United Nations kid in high school, but then I completely lost faith in the system and ended up doing not exactly that. But yeah, I was adamant about going into human rights and being a human rights lawyer. And yeah, since probably when I was 13, and then academia came up as an option first year of uni. And look where I'm now.
Yeah, so I did not have that straight of a path towards my job, towards the career that I'm now having. There were so many oddities and coincidences and blind chances, because to begin with, I never even planned to study law, unlike Başak. Because when I was finishing high school, I thought I would follow my father's footsteps and become a journalist. And I even participated in this program that the, I think, National Journalist Union of Ukraine had when they provided kind of educational grants at several journalist faculties across the country. But it so happened that one such faculty was actually part of the law school. And it was the faculty of legal journalism, whatever that means, at the Odessa Law Academy. It had nothing to do with journalism, in fact, because when I got there, I found myself just surrounded by a very orthodox legal educational structure. And it was shock at first, but then, I learned to appreciate more theoretical subjects like legal theory, legal history, and it gradually sparked my interest in legal philosophy, because I find law to be quite boring, to be honest, but the concept of law quite fascinating. And so I wrote a thesis on legal philosophy and defended it in Ukraine back in 2012. It was for a now obsolete degree of the candidate of legal sciences. Now we just call all candidate degrees Doctor of Philosophy, following the European terminology. And I started working as a lecturer in Ukraine, a lecturer in legal theory. And it only some years after, I think deep in my 20s, that I grew interested in international law, but primarily also as a legal philosopher. And I applied for a research stay at the University of Groningen, and I came here and I liked it here, and I met wonderful people. And so we thought, hey, what would be the nice way for me to work there? And I applied for a PhD program. So I did another doctorate in the Netherlands. And not long before defending my thesis here in Groningen, I got an offer to become a lecturer. And and here I am.
I always find it funny that we had the opposite route to the philosophy of international law. Like, Kostia was a legal philosopher who took an interest in international law, and I was an international lawyer who was completely disillusioned by, as I said, the system. So I was asking more and more meta questions, I guess, and we ended up roughly at the same place.
And physically at the same place eventually.
Yes.
Yes, which is kind of cool, right? Because yeah, Başak, you were first in France, then in the UK, and now you're in the Netherlands.
To me, it's one of those unbelievable things. Like we were talking about Twitter just before. Me working in Groningen is all Twitter's doing. I owe a lot of my career to Twitter, which is I don't know, maybe a sad thing to say, but it worked for a while there.
Yeah, and Kostia, I say I'm with you. I find law in and of itself incredibly boring, but I find what law does to society deeply fascinating. So I'm kind of with you, but coming at it from a social theory rather than philosophy's approach. So yeah.
Well, I just spend most of my time looking at the over 300 articles and 7 annexes of the Law of the Sea Convention. So I don't know what any of you are talking about. But I mean, over my career though, yeah, I guess I have got more interested in the meta questions. And Tamsin and I have this sort of running joke where I say, I'm a desk-bound positivist, and anytime she detects that I've done work that of a vaguely theoretical bent, or worse yet, field research, she usually yells at me.
I usually quite yell perfidy very
I was about
loudly
to
in
say
the middle of
the
a
word in question
conference.
is usually perfidy.
Yeah.
But Başak, congratulations on reaching disillusionment with the system so early. It takes most of us, 10 to 15 years of an established career, but there you go.
Yeah. I don't know if that helped me, if it helped my mental state, let's say. But yeah, I was wondering whether we should be using a trigger warning before calling international law or law boring in front of Douglas.
Yeah, I also thought about that I should have.
He deals with myself and Dina on a regular basis. He knows. We embrace him for his weird, quirky interests.
I'm an inclusive positivist, but not an inclusive positivist.
Okay.
That's as much legal theory as you're getting out of me tonight.
So we move on then to our main event. And the questions I kind of have for us to discuss is, how does podcasting fit into the discourse of international law? What sort of a role does it play? Is it a side event like public lectures or conference papers? Or does it have a space in these mainstream discussions? And how have your experiences of being an international law scholar who podcasts on international law shaped your views on this?
What a loaded bunch of questions, especially if we've been talking about disillusionment with the system. And yeah, so when we were talking about this episode, when it was still like an idea, I mentioned it to Kostia, and we both said, do podcasts enter the discourse at all? I'm a skeptic. I mean, as much as there is a main event, yes, this is a side event, but is there even a main event in that sense? So yeah, challenging the questions right from the start, right?
Like any good philosopher, just refusing to accept the premise of the question.
Well, yeah, I also have a bit of a philosophical point, but unlike Başak challenging the question, I was trying to read the question in its best light and trying to also figure out, what the role was. Because to me, yeah, the first reaction when you send us an email inviting to talk about the role of international law podcast, and I was like, hey, role? Do we actually have a role? Because yeah, to me, doing a podcast has always also felt like a hobby, like a fun activity and a way to connect to people. So I had never actually thought about it as actually contributing to anything out there, kind of a little thing of its own. And when we were just starting, I remember I had a very little ambition in terms of the outreach. We thought if like 100 people listened to an episode in a week, that would be a huge success already. I think we hit 100 plays like in the first hour or something. And it was actually quite surprising. And of course, when Borderline Jurisprudence became more popular, even though I think it's a very niche thing, we realized that in fact there is a demand, for this sort of stuff. There are people who are actually interested in listening to this. To me, it's still surprising, by the way. And so I think it's fair to say that we had maybe two categories of guests, and therefore two kind of different roles that I think we might have played, even though it wasn't intentional, I might say. And it is like very rude, I think, distinction, because oftentimes these two categories overlap. So first, there were people whose work we love and admire, and to whom we were just excited to talk and discuss their ideas, right? So this is how the podcast actually started. So David Lefkowitz, so our very first guest, Dina Tsuvala, Adil Haq, Monica Hakimi, Inga Venske, Jean Daprimon, and others, right? So, and in this context, we also, I think, closer to like when we got a little bit bolder, and I don't know what Başak thinks of that, we also started to use the podcast kind of as a vehicle to approach scholars whom we would have otherwise not dared to, I guess, like Marty Koskiniemi or Anne Orford or the blessed Hilary Charlesworth, of course. And on the other hand, like the second category were the early career scholars like us, whom we maybe wanted to promote. Yeah, so that was kind of the idea, like Francesca Iorlaro or Alex Green and others. And so speaking of a role, I always thought that the second aspect was quite important, because we had some sort of a platform. And also like something that we discussed earlier, this kind of like community building that cannot be underestimated. So we started in the midst of the COVID lockdown when the world seemed very distant and isolating, and having a pod and seeing a community of people growing around it, it was actually very fulfilling and nice. So yeah, I think if anything, if I can speak of myself, I think I did the podcast primarily for myself. And that's probably why it's so difficult to kind of think of a role, because I don't think we actually had any agenda in mind.
For sure, for sure. I still don't know who listened to it that wasn't a friend of mine.
Well,
Like,
I do,
who
because
are
I
these
think,
people?
I mean, I still have, people whom I never met, like who approach and say, "Hey, yeah, I know you from a podcast." Okay, cool. Wow.
Yeah, that is also
I mean, Borderline Jurisprudence still sits in the recommended reading list for my undergraduate international law class.
Oh, this is
Is it
so
not
cute.
too much for undergraduate students?
They
Like, this is
don't
more
have
my
to. It's recommended. It's not
Mm.
required. It's if you're interested in this, go have a listen.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so I think in terms of the influence of podcasting, I think one of the sort of breakthroughs for it is that sort of teaching crossover space. I've noticed that Call to the Bar is beginning to kind of come up on reading lists, and some, to my mind, fairly random episodes have play counts that are sort of through the roof compared to our baseline. And it looks like our recent episode on the Lotus case is going to be one of the more popular, which I just find, well, I'm personally quite gratified because, the Lotus case is something I could talk about until I'm physically restrained. But the fact that it actually appears to have found an audience is sort of slightly mind-bending. But when I encountered this question in sort of vague preparation for the episode, I actually, again, being the token positivist, sort of thought of the international law hierarchy of sources in terms of what people will put in footnotes as opposed to formal sources of law. And so I think that sort of hierarchy goes, or even worse, Tamsin, from a sociological perspective, it's probably a hierarchy of respectability. So the first thing people want to footnote is usually, books and peer-reviewed articles. Then under that, there's sort of the tier for blog posts, conference papers, and SSRN papers. Then under that, you've sort of got probably newspapers and journalism. And then under that, you might see tweets, social media posts. And I'm not sure I've yet seen a podcast in a footnote. I footnoted a podcast once and it didn't make the cut after the peer review and editing. Not because anyone told me to take it out, but just, sentences went and the footnote was attached to them. So I think, there's this sort of thing where internet-based material, although everything's internet-based now, but blogs now have a respected and understood place in the scholarship, right? They're short accounts from experts on particular issues. And sort of some tweets or social media posts are creeping into that space. Like I've seen a whole article in the Chinese Journal of International Law, a journal with which I have a somewhat fractious relationship, where the article kicks off by talking about how I got provisional measures in one of the genocide cases wrong in a tweet. I'm like, well, I'd had 2 or 3 glasses of Chardonnay. It was 9 or 10 o'clock at night. Like, it was not exactly a peer-reviewed output. But if it gave someone a springboard for starting their article by saying that, you know, someone else had been wrong on the internet, then fair enough. So I do wonder if podcasts are sort of still kind of creeping up that ladder of respectability, and that break onto reading lists is kind of the first cautious suggestion that these, you know, this medium has a place in the hierarchy of respectability. But I mean, otherwise, I'd agree with everything that has already been said. I think podcasts have a lot more influence than visibility at the moment, and we find that when people say to me, as to Kostia, oh, I know you from the podcast, or I listen to the podcast, or we get these random notes of appreciation from, you know, students or colleagues, or occasionally quite frighteningly QCs or judges of international tribunals. I had a thought, and I think I followed it to the end, and I should probably stop while I still sound coherent.
And I'm going to kind of build on that and say I've experienced the fact that I'm getting messages saying this thing just happened, is called to the bar going to do an episode unpacking it. And we've seen some episodes where we've done that, sometimes prompted, sometimes not. And I think that that's kind of where what spurned my desire to have this conversation about the role in the discourse is the turn to potentially, I mean, maybe it's a quirk of Call to the Bar, but the turn to podcasts as a more accessible source of expert information, because you can put it on while you're at the gym and listen to it while you're at the gym. You don't have to stand, you know, you don't have to sit and read. You know, is it fulfilling that hole that, you know, we think about public lectures and what have you, you can go and attend and there's a lecturer, but it's not, and sometimes it's recorded, but is it filling that hole of people are interested in understanding these concepts, and an international law book is really, theoretical book is really intimidating, but, you know, the 4 of us talking shit about international law over drinks is actually really easy to engage with. Is it an entry point for people who don't, you know, who aren't international lawyers or aren't specialists in a specific area of international law to start learning more and engaging more? And I have a hand from Douglas.
Well, I mean, just on that, like I'm the sort of, you know, jobbing positivist buried in articles of UNCLOS or the ICC statute, who always felt quite intimidated by people doing, you know, the really brainy jurisprudential international law. So one of the things, you know, I actually really liked about Borderline Jurisprudence was that it provided an accessible on-ramp to some of these debates. And I also think, you know, in the international law space, as with everything else now, there's just so much going on all the time. Like, you know, I don't have the reading time or the concentration, you know, to keep on top of everything I might find interesting. Like, it's really difficult to carve out time to read anything that's not related to an immediate project. But I don't know how others feel.
I was, as I was listening to you, I was also wondering, because Borderline Jurisprudence and Call to the Bar are different formats, right? And I'm wondering if in Call to the Bar, there's this, do you feel like you're able to communicate some thoughts you have, some ideas you had, but in a less formal manner, and therefore through less work than sort of trying to put together in a nice, neat blog post or with footnotes and things? It's just an easier way to get things.
I'm personally allowed to swear more on a podcast than I am in a journal article, and I find that comforting.
Liberating.
I can be myself more. I'm a high school dropout who became a chef. There are words that sound like hello to me that I will not repeat on a podcast because I've been asked specifically not to. Kostia.
Yeah. So it's interesting. Yeah. So some reflections on what just now been said. So about this hierarchy of respectable sources, Douglas, which you referred to, I actually cited podcasts in my writings 3 times. So I had 2 references to our own podcast in my PhD thesis, but I mean, that hardly counts. Another is in my current writing. I've actually referenced one of your episodes, from the 5th of March. Maybe we will return to it. Group therapy, so long, and it was nice knowing you all international law. It was a very fun episode. I really enjoyed it. But also, I think, like, to me, it would be very odd indeed to place podcast below tweets or something, because I think most people actually, if they refer to tweets, they treat them most as data, right? As okay, oh, politicians are saying this, or I don't know, this has been a trend, or something like that, rather than actually pieces of analysis. So when you mentioned that someone actually referred to your tweet in an article, that is odd to me. Like, why would you do that, right? It's a tweet. It's not like really that rigorous, right? And that made me thinking about this, yeah, and that made me think about the idea of podcasts being more informal, maybe, than blog posts and articles, and maybe that's true. But on the other hand, I recall how much work it is actually to prepare for episodes, at least in the format that we had for Borderline Jurisprudence. Like, when for each episode you actually have to read like entire books or sets of articles, and it takes weeks, if not months, to prepare for one conversation, to come up with good questions. It's actually quite a rigorous work oftentimes, and I don't think we've always done that great of a job. But looking back, I think we did actually pretty well. But yeah, I mean, maybe it's indeed the case that podcasts are not so much treated as scholarly sources, as bits of more like informal conversation, more like almost like conference coffee breaks of sorts. Yeah, but conference coffee breaks that can be listened to at any time. And I still vividly remember the shock that I had when we invited Blessed Hillary Charlesworth to the podcast, sending her an email, and we didn't even know if she would reply. And she replied literally saying something like, "Oh yes, I would love to. Your podcast is widely listened to at the ICJ." That was mind-blowing.
Yeah, that was a shock. But I just want to open and close parentheses by saying, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, yes, it was an incredible amount of work, but one of us most of the time did a very good job, and another one of us, who I will not name, but it is me, was having trouble keeping up. Let's just
Untrue.
be honest.
Untrue.
No, because you all don't know the amount of reading Kostia is capable of, and I just have a brain the size of a peanut, so
You're being too modest, way too modest. You did amazing.
the truths have to be told. The people must know.
But yeah, well, I think that sort of goes to, though, the different sort of niches podcasts can fill for people, and the different ways you can present them, right? So yours was much more of still much more informal than, say, a seminar you might go to with a visiting scholar at your law faculty, but not a completely different thing from that. Paper, discussant, Q&A. So it felt less formal, but still kind of the faculty. Whereas what I always wanted to get to with Called to the Bar, which I think happily enough we've achieved, was a sense of how you talk about international law with colleagues at the conference bar, which is often where I've learnt a lot more about current developments and plugged gaps in my ignorance, particularly as to the literature, by just sort of, hearing from other people what they find interesting. Tamsin?
It's also how we got to the point of, isn't cutting submarine cables just piracy? And then Rob McLaughlin sent us 50,000 words to edit into 2 different articles on the history of why it's just piracy.
Yeah. And so the thing I find about the less scripted Call to the Bar format is, and I think I said this in our year in review episode that, I often come away from those conversations, as I do at sort of conference conversations, feeling smarter, because not only have I been exposed to things I didn't know, but I kind of feel like, ideas or things I'm interested in get sharpened in the course of the conversation. And that's what I've got a lot out of it, but I think that sort of spontaneity and that sense that we're building on each other's ideas makes it listenable to, but in a different way from some other podcasts. But I mean, Borderline Jurisprudence also, though within its chosen framework, had a more conversational sense, I think, than some international law and legal podcasts, which are far more a kind of heavily scripted or conventional interview format. And there's space for all of those things in the ecosystem. But Australians aren't terribly good at formality and reverence to institutions. I mean, okay, we know some stuffy hidebound lawyers, won't mention any. But in general, that's the national vibe, right? So
I don't understand what you mean at all. Why would you say that? I don't get it.
But I do think that's been unexpectedly one of the things people have enjoyed about Called to the Bar, is that, we're just trying to have a conversation amongst friends about stuff that is currently happening, and occasionally interviewing people. And again, people sometimes who, we just wanted to interview. Like when Tamsin had said that she'd lined you guys up as guests, I was like, I will imitate a theorist to get onto this call. So
Wow.
Borderline Jurisprudence was one of the podcasts that was most responsible for Called to the Bar, along with probably Craig Martin's Jib Jab. So, because my work wasn't of a kind where you would want to interview me, and you didn't interview me, I just had to find my own podcast, right? So here we are.
Building on those comments there, I would say the biggest comment I've got from students, both regarding borderline jurisprudence and Called to the Bar, from where I've assigned it in teaching, but also just random emails and my own experience with borderline jurisprudence, has been the way it provides an entry point to the discourse on a certain topic, and that I think I think that that's where we land as the niche. It provides an accessible entry point. So I've had students and people say, I really didn't feel part of international law. I didn't feel like I could understand it. I didn't feel like I could get across it. There was too much. It was too complex. There were too many old white men gatekeeping. And this podcast has really made me feel like I actually can be an international lawyer. And in relation to borderline jurisprudence, the big theoretical concepts that take a lot of reading, which it's clear that, the amount of reading that goes into preparing that, I personally would never have gone near those topics if not for borderline jurisprudence, because I didn't have the energy to read that. And I find it interesting, but doesn't fit with the theoretical stuff I'm working with neatly. So I'd never really need to engage with it, but I find it interesting and I like hearing about what people are doing. And so I think that there's a really valuable space in that. And Kostia.
Yeah, it's actually interesting that comes together with, again, this discourse of sources. To me, like, preparing for borderline jurisprudence episodes often felt, again, like, in a coffee break at a conference, you want to approach a scholar and say, hey, I love your work, but here I have a question, because I read something of you and I wanted to kind of, unpack this a little bit. But at the same time, to have this sort of a conversation more referenceable, so you actually push people to answer the question that you have that they would probably not address on themselves in their writing, because they're just not interested in that, or because this is not something they work on. But you kind of push them to answer those questions because you're interested in them, right? And then you can actually use that as a material for your own writing and kind of build up on that. And this is the reason actually why I referenced two of the borderline jurisprudence episodes in my
Can
thesis,
we ask
because
which ones?
Yeah, I mean, my thesis is in open access, so it's easy to check. I think it was Adil Haq and Scott Shapiro, if I'm not mistaken. But I'm now doubting myself. One is definitely Scott Shapiro's, and another, yeah, I think it was Adil Haq's. Yeah.
There you go. Do we have any kind of other closing comments on this big issue of the place that podcasting has in the discourse, or shall we kind of move?
Look, as I say on almost every episode, time is always against us, and we need to move on. But I just my sort of last thought, though, in terms of podcasters being a way to get into issues or fields you're not fully familiar with. I know podcasts aren't for everyone. We actually have a number of members of the Call to the Bar team who are not, unlike me, complete podcast addicts, and there are also perfectly ordinary human beings who don't like wearing headphones, for example, and so won't listen to that many podcasts. But carving that to one side, I do think there's something very human about listening to a conversation. And I think human beings are wired to take in information in an oral tradition, be that, a conversation or, origins of philosophy, sort of discourses and Socratic methods.
Good thing, and I'd like to remind everyone, we are not using footnotes here, and this has not been peer-reviewed. Please proceed, Douglas.
Oh, right, yeah. I'll just give my completely random history of the intellectual tradition of the West, founded in nothing but my own prejudices. Great. But you know what I mean, right? There is something about hearing people talk about their work that is very different from trying to wade through all the footnotes. And I think for me, that often has the experience, and maybe this is where it's useful for teaching, and maybe this is just reflecting what you said, Tams, in a slightly different way. It can be much faster to put the intellectual framework around a topic if you hear something like that. Like the greatest lectures you had in your undergrad degree probably had some of the same characteristic, that you felt like someone was just speaking to you and putting a context around a topic with which you are unfamiliar. And I think that, and the sort of combination of the immediacy, I think, of having someone speaking directly into your ears, I think gives it an accessibility and an intimacy that a lot of that just trudging through page after page after page of material doesn't always have.
I think immediacy is a great word, because if you listen to something long enough, you feel like you know those people and you're part of the conversation in a way, and you maybe articulate your thoughts in response to that. So yeah, I think that the intimate setting is, it makes a difference than being talked at a lecture, for example.
Yeah, I fully agree, and I think this is a great explanation of why podcasts have been such a popular medium as well. And it's actually also funny because I've never been prone to listening to podcasts. I don't know why. I just, even though I was making one, but I never really listened to podcasts that much. I don't know. They just don't fit my the way that I live, I guess. I never have that many dishes to do, or I don't, have to commute for that long to listen to podcasts. But occasionally I do, and I really enjoy this experience. But I think one of the reasons why I was surprised that Borderline Jurisprudence became a success is maybe exactly because of this conversational nature, paradoxically, because to me it's a bit counterintuitive that people might actually be interested in listening to other people's conversation without a chance of actually, tuning in. It's almost like you're just sitting on a train and eavesdropping on someone's conversation, which is interesting. Yeah, okay, fine. But it also feels weird, right? So I still have that kind of odd vibe around podcasts for some reason. I don't know. That's just my quirk.
What I am hearing, though, is that we need to get you a dog so you're doing more walking. That's what I'm hearing, is that we need to get you a dog, possibly similar to the Admiral, to have some walking adventure string time, to listen to some podcasts.
My cat would be very unhappy about that.
Yeah,
that's true.
Say, if you knew Kostia's cat, you would not be suggesting this.
I mean, quite possibly. So, moving on. Now, Borderline Jurisprudence has been something of a hiatus since your last episode. So, tell us, what have you both been doing since then? What's been happening post borderline jurisprudence?
Well, it's actually a very good question because it makes me reflect on a lot of things. But I think to me, after the war broke down, it took me like some time to come to senses. Also because it happened just 3 days after I defended my PhD thesis. And in many ways, I had to, I think, somehow reimagine myself as a scholar because all of a sudden doing what I was doing did not seem like a sensible strategy anymore. I was like, who needs analytical philosophy of international law? Very much focused on some core questions of either liberal framework. What is the structure of the authority of international law? How does practical reasoning differ internationally and domestically, and so on? So who needs all that when the world has literally fallen apart? That was kind of my thinking. But also what struck me at the beginning of the war was the clear lack, I think, of understanding among many brilliant international scholars, not only lawyers, of what Russia was doing and saying. And that occupied so much of my thinking that I guess the doing a podcast, felt like more marginal, So because to me, like thinking about the war and about what Russia was saying and doing, it made almost too much sense, but also rubbed in lots of doubts. So over the course of 2022 and 23, I have been trying to pick up some threads of what has become now my project that occupies most of my time. And perhaps the best way actually to shortly explain what I'm now doing is to actually refer back to that episode that I just mentioned of your podcast. Yeah, so the recent episode that's called Group Therapy, So Long and Thanks for All the International Law of the 5th of March this year. And there I think it was Douglas who, closer to the end of the episode, said that we are now shifting away from the universalist imaginary of international law and towards more regionalist structure, and that some thinly universal links may remain, like the law of treaties, for example, but all of the universality is dead. And of course, now it is in many ways more true than in 2022 with all the Trump's havoc. But fundamentally, I think the problem runs a little deeper. It is not only that we are entering this era of new regionalism with greater spaces and all that. It is also, I think, that we are entering an era of the end of unity of the criteria for what even counts as international law and persuasive international legal argument. So we are having not only a new spatial arrangement and imaginary of international law, but also structural and conceptual one. And I'm not sure we are ready for that intellectually, scholarly. We are, I think, still lacking understanding and maybe even imagination to deal with what non-liberal or even illiberal forms of international legality can look like. So normally, scholarly accounts of, for instance, authoritarian international law, they focus predominantly on the normative content, as in authoritarian states may have different ideas about what certain rules of international law are or what they mean, like on human rights or sovereignty or non-intervention or whatever. But in my project focusing on Russia, I actually hypothesized that, look, it is not even about rules anymore. So rules and rule following, rights and obligations that follow from rules, all this legalist imaginary is intrinsically linked to the liberal internationalism. So what Russia is trying to do, I think, is trying to replace this whole logic and morality of rules and the package deal that comes with it, like, for instance, separation of law from politics, differentiation between lawmaking and adjudication, and so on and so on. It tries to replace it with the logic of morality of historical narration, of fables, if you will, even, and deduce rights and obligations from there. So this is why we do not really see that much of a rule-centric talk from Russia. They rarely ever refer to specific rules of international law, and yet they speak of international law as such all the time. So, and I think it is some new language, maybe, of international law with its own structure, which is openly illiberal, and that we are not equipped to maybe even register as legal oftentimes. And this is what my current project is about this, what I call alternative legality, which is not only spatially, but also structurally distinct. And in this alternative structure of international law, there might not even be a place for the thinly liberal law of treaties, for instance. So this is, in short, what I've been doing now.
That's really interesting, and we are going to have another episode on that.
Super
Because-
interesting, and yes, we will.
Yeah, like, let's talk about when we're going to get you back to talk about that, because, oh yeah, I really want to talk about this.
Sure.
Başak, what have you been up to?
Am I supposed to follow that?
You are, I'm sorry.
Last episode was, when was it? 2022?
I think 23, if I'm not wrong. Let me check. I think
Must
it
be
was
20.
in
Oh,
May
yeah.
23.
Yeah, May 23. Yeah, that's when things went south for me. Like my the world was already in shambles somewhat, but my personal life also decided to join. So a lot of things that I had built came crumbling down, and I moved to a different country, which is now the Netherlands, and started a new job, which is now my the PhD program, in which Kostia is my supervisor. That was the good part, yeah. But so, yeah, I was teaching full time in Paris, and then that contract ended, and then I moved to Edinburgh for a visiting research stay, and then yeah, everything crumbled down, and I found myself sort of looking for a way out intellectually, and yeah, I found that home in Groningen, and now my PhD project sort of had been boiling in my head for a while, but basically it's about change and how change happens in international treaty law, and about how the words, the black letter words, stay the same, but the meaning they carry changes. And I haven't figured it out yet, obviously, but I'm making my way through. It's funny in the sense that it takes, like, the premise of it is that it's all a fiction and that things are not what they seem, which is obviously something that we know but choose to sort of not ignore, but like we have to make that abstraction to continue doing international law, right, Douglas? Like we know it's all a fiction
Sure.
that it
Yeah, no, of course it's a fiction. Yeah.
yeah, but
I
so
would say it's storytelling rather than fiction, but yeah, that's
sure,
splitting
sure.
hairs.
Sure. But basically, my project is about saying the king is naked and calling things out, and sort of, instead of going on because the system functions in some way, it's about sitting with the discomfort of it and just seeing where it takes us, the discomfort.
Okay, so we're also, when you're a bit more further through this, going to have a chat with you on this about that project, because you and I have a lot to talk about here. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of kind of crossover with what I'm doing. So yeah, now we're going to wrap up, and usually we'd ask a question about, non-international law escape routes and what are you reading, but however, we're moving to something a little bit different for season 2. And so, Kostia, Başak, who is one of your favorite obscure or underrated characters in fiction, and why do they speak to you?
I actually go and answer both questions, maybe, because they are very much, I think, interrelated. Because I'm actually now reading a book with the character who is not yet, I think, very well known, but I think this book might become a bit more popular in upcoming months because it was long listed for Booker. But it has a character that I relate to very much, and this is the book by Solveig Bade on Calculation of Volume, and it is the main character of this book is Tara Stelter, and it's essentially like a Groundhog Day, but in a much more philosophical way. So she's stuck in the 18th of November. So this is the day that keeps repeating itself over and over and over again. She moves on through time, so she's aging and she's consuming things that do not return to the world, but the rest of the world kind of resets every night. And this has sort of been the feeling that I've been having since the start of the war. Kind of like, first of all, living one day at a time, but also, also like feeling that you're somehow suspended in time, that you're keep waiting for the normal line of time to restore itself, but also knowing deep inside that it's not going to happen, right? So this is I think very relatable to me right now.
Mine is, so I panicked when I saw this question because I was like, I don't read any fiction. And then I realized it doesn't have to be something I read. It can be something I've seen. And I do go to the cinema a lot. And it's this movie, the 2024 movie called My Favorite Cake. The Farsi original is Cake Mahbuba Man. And it's about this older lady whose husband died young, and she lives alone, and her children are far away. And she's lonely but content with how life is. And she has her friends, and they come over and they have these little tea parties. And I don't want to spoil the movie, but she meets someone and they get close. But as you can imagine, it's like these movies never end happily, right? I will not say how, but it's not about the movie isn't about feminism, but there is feminism in it because there's this woman that is not fitting into society because she chose to be alone, and at the end she doesn't get her happy ending, but she stays strong in like a wise but also sad way. Like you kind of wish she got her happy ending. And obviously, since it's in around like the regimes, there's criticism of the regime in the background, but it's a very personal story. It's not about the regime at all. And I thought that she was so strong and elegant in some way, in the way that she dealt with what life gave her. Yeah, Mahin, she's the protagonist's name is Mahin. She touched me.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate that. And finally, Douglas, the one that's on all of our listeners' minds, what are you wearing this evening?
Well, as you said, it's been the beginning of autumn in Canberra, so I've actually been able to break out my green corduroy trousers, a matching green wool jacket, and a contrast green wool herringbone waistcoat. But because Başak praised it on social media, I am in fact wearing the first ever tie I made. So I'm trying to take up sewing as a hobby this year, both because I'm interested in clothes and also I think actually trying new hobbies is good for you when you become an expert in something like international law. You can forget what it's like to learn things from scratch. So anyway, this tie is actually made out of an outdoor furniture fabric, polyester, which I thought was ridiculously difficult to sew at the time, but realized keeps its shape much better than more conventional materials, emblazoned with a pattern of Banksia's, which is a native Australian flower.
It
Fantastic.
looks gorgeous.
I recognized as soon as we arrived on Zoom, and I was like, that's the tie, because it's just such a joyful pattern. It's beautiful.
You told me it was a rule that I had to find an occasion to wear it, and you know, I am the positivist on this call, so here we are.
I don't make the rules, but that was the rule.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Excellent. And that's what we have time for in this episode. So we'll talk to you all next time. Bye-bye.